Part 2. Freudianism subsumes feminism. To the two main points of this chapter. First, that Freudianism and feminism grew out of the same historical conditions, and second, that Freudianism and feminism are based on the same set of realities. I shall add a third. Freudianism subsumed the place of feminism as the lesser of two evils. We have shown how Freudianism hit the same nerve that feminism did. Both at once were responses to centuries of increasing privatization of family life, its extreme subjugation of women, and the sex repressions and subsequent neuroses this caused. Freud, too, was once considered a sex maniac destructive to society. He was ridiculed and despised as much as were the militant feminists. It was only much later that Freudianism became as sacred as an established religion. How did this reversal come about? Let us first consider the social context of the development of both feminism and Freudianism. We have seen that the ideas of the early radical feminists contained the seeds of the coming sexual revolution. We have seen that though in many cases the feminists themselves did not clearly grasp the importance of what they had stumbled into, though often they did not have down a thorough and consistent radical feminist critique of society, and given the political climate at the time, it is no wonder. The reaction of society to them indicates that their enemies knew what they were about, if they themselves weren't sure. The virulent anti-feminist literature of the time, often written by men well respected and honest in their own fields of endeavor, illustrates the threat the feminists presented to the establishment. I have also shown in the past chapter how the movement was redirected into an all-consuming effort to obtain the vote, and how in this way it was sidetracked and destroyed. Following the end of the feminist movement with the granting of the vote came the era of the flappers, an era that in its pseudo-liberated sexuality much resembles our own. The widespread female rebellion stirred up by the feminist movement now had nowhere to go. Girls who had cut their hair, shortened their skirts, and gone off to college no longer had a political direction for their frustration. Instead, they danced it away in marathons, or expended themselves swimming the Channel and flying airplanes across the Atlantic. They were a roused class who did not know what to do with their consciousness. They were told then, as we are still told now, quote, "You've got civil rights, short skirts, and sexual liberty. You've won your revolution. What more do you want?" End quote. But the quote-unquote revolution had been won within a system organized around the patriarchal nuclear family. And as Herbert Marcuse in Eros and Civilization shows, within such a repressive structure only a more sophisticated repression can result, quote-unquote, repressive desublimation. Quote, "In a repressive society, individual happiness and productive development are in contradiction to society. If they are defined as values to be realized within the society, they become themselves repressive. The concept of repressive desublimation is the release of sexuality in modes and forms which reduce and weaken erotic energy. In this process, sexuality spreads into formerly tabooed dimensions and relations. However, instead of recreating these dimensions and relations in the images of the pleasure principle, the opposite tendency asserts itself. The reality principle extends its hold over Eros. The most telling illustration is provided by the methodical introduction of sexiness into business, politics, propaganda, etc." End quote. Here in the 20s began the stereotypes of the American quote-unquote career girl, the quote-unquote co-ed, and the quote-unquote butchy businesswoman. This image of the supposedly quote-unquote liberated woman went around the world via Hollywood, the unbalancing effects on women of pseudo-liberation giving anti-feminists new ammunition, and further bolstering the resistance of the still openly male supremacist societies to setting quote-unquote their women free. Quote, We like our women the way they are, womanly, end quote. American servicemen came back from the Second World War with stories of those great continental women who still knew how to make a man feel good. The word castration began to circulate. And finally, in America, in the 40s, Freudianism came in big. Meanwhile, Freudianism itself had undergone deep internal changes. Emphasis had shifted from the original psychoanalytic theory to clinical practice. In the final chapter of Eros and Civilization, Marcuse discusses the reactionary implications of this shift, showing how the contradiction between Freud's ideas and the possibility of any effective quote-unquote therapy based on them. Psychoanalysis cannot affect individual happiness in a society, the structure of which can tolerate no more than severely controlled individual happiness, finally caused the assimilation of the theory to suit the practice. Quote, the most speculative and quote-unquote metaphysical concepts not subject to clinical verification were minimized and discarded altogether. Moreover, in the process, some of Freud's most decisive concepts, such as the relation between the id and the ego, the function of the unconscious, and the scope and significance of sexuality, were redefined in such a way that their explosive content was all but eliminated. The revisionists have converted the weakening of Freud's theory into a new theory. End quote. The term that perhaps best characterizes this neo-Freudian revisionism is quote-unquote adjustment. But adjustment to what? The underlying assumption is that one must accept the reality in which one finds oneself. But what happens if one is a woman, a black, or a member of any other especially unfortunate class of society? Then one is doubly unlucky. Then one not only has to achieve a normalcy that even for the privileged is, as we have shown, difficult and precarious at best, but one must also quote-unquote adjust to the specific racism or sexism that limits one's potential from the very beginning. One must abandon all attempts at self-definition or determination. Thus, in Marcuse's view, the process of therapy becomes merely, quote, a course in resignation, end quote. The difference between health and neurosis only, quote, the degree and effectiveness of the resignation, end quote. For, as in the often quoted statement of Freud to his patient, Studies in Hysteria, 1895, quote, a great deal will be gained if we succeed through therapy in transforming your hysterical misery into everyday unhappiness, end quote. And as all those who have undergone therapy can attest, that's just about the size of it. Cleaver's description of his analysis in Soul on Ice speaks for the experience of any other oppressed person as well. Quote, I had several sessions with a psychiatrist. His conclusion was that I hated my mother. How he arrived at this conclusion I'll never know because he knew nothing about my mother, and when he'd ask me questions, I would answer him with absurd lies. What revolted me about him was that he had heard me denouncing whites, yet each time he deliberately guided the conversation back to my family life, to my childhood. That in itself was all right, but he deliberately blocked all my attempts to bring out the racial question, and he made it clear that he was not interested in my attitudes towards whites. This was a Pandora's box he did not care to open, end quote. Theodor Reich, perhaps the prototype of the cracker-barrel layman's Freud, exemplifies the crassness and insensitivity of most psychoanalysts to the real problems of their patients. It is remarkable that, with so many writings on the emotional differences between men and women, Reich should never have discovered the objective difference in their social situations. For example, he observes, in passing, differences like the following without ever drawing the right conclusions. Quote, little girls sometimes whisper to each other, men do this or that. Little boys almost never speak of women in this way. A woman gives much more thought to being a woman than a man to being a man. Most women, when they ask a favor of a man, smile. In the same situation, men rarely smile. To be a ladies' man means somewhere not to be much of a man. Almost all women are afraid that the man they love will leave them, but hardly a man is afraid that a woman will leave him. Women in groups sometimes say, "My lord and master, let me out of the house tonight." Men say, "My ball and chain." End quote. And here is a random sampling of his neo-Freudian contributions to sexual understanding. Quote, "The first impression one gets of a young woman entering a room full of people is that of concealed or well-disguised insecurity. It seems that being the possessor of a penis protects men against such over-self-awareness. Men are not at home in the universe and therefore have to explore it. Women who form the chain of all organic beings are at home in the world and do not feel the urge to find out all about it. It seems to me that psychoanalytic research in emphasizing the physical deficiency in the genitals region which the little girl experiences has neglected the aesthetic value and its significance in the development of the feminine attitude. I assume that the little girl who compares her genitals to those of the little boy finds her own ugly. Not only the greater modesty of women, but their never-ceasing striving towards beautifying and adoring their bodies is to be understood as displacement and extension of their effort to overcompensate for their original impressions that their genitals are ugly. I believe that cleanliness has a double origin, the first in the taboos of tribes, and the second another matter coming thousands of years later, namely in women's awareness of their own odor, specifically the bad smells caused by the secretion of their genitals." End quote. And a typical therapeutic interpretation. Quote, "A patient was afraid to show me her book. It occurred to me, this patient, who had during the preceding transference shown clear indications of transference love for me, now acts as if the book were a child she had gotten by me. She acts the way a woman does who has to show her child to her husband for the first time. She is afraid he might not like the newborn baby." End quote. It reads like a Freudian joke book. Reich's female patients, in contrast, were often touchingly perceptive, even brilliantly astute. They were far more in touch with the reality of their situation than he was ever able to be. Quote, "A woman seems incapable of expressing her strong negative feelings and explains her incapacity in a psychoanalytic session. Quote, I am afraid to show these emotions because if I did, it would be like opening Pandora's box. I am afraid that my aggressiveness would destroy all," end quote. Before she left, I took her to the window and showed her the stores across the street and their signs in neon letters and said, quote, "Isn't it a woman's world," end quote. But she was not much impressed by this and replied, quote, "Walk down Wall Street and you'll see it's a man's world," end quote. A patient notes that men are odd. They do not permit us to be only women. I mean women with all their weaknesses. But they do not for a moment let us forget that we are only women. End quote. How can these women stand Reich's misogyny? They can't. Quote, "When I told a patient in her 40s that she had wanted to be a boy like her brother, she began to curse and abuse me, saying, quote, 'Fuck you,' end quote, and quote, 'Go to hell,' end quote, and other unladylike expressions." End quote. But the doctor wins. Quote, "When it was time for her to leave, she stood for a while longer than usual before the mirror in my anteroom, putting her hair in order. I smilingly remarked, quote, 'I am glad to see a remnant of femininity,' end quote, end quote." Here are a few other female reactions. Quote, "When you listen to me a long time without saying anything, I often have the impression that what I say is silly woman stuff and without value. It is as if you do not consider it worth your while to speak to me." Woman criticizing her psychoanalyst, quote, "Even your spontaneity is artificial," end quote. The patient had been silent for a longer time than usual and then said in a quiet manner, quote, "God damn, I don't know why I'm here. Go fuck yourself," end quote. End quote. It is not that these women were unaware of their situation. On the contrary, they were in Reich's office because of their awareness. There is no other way to handle their frustration because there is no way to handle it short of revolution. We have arrived at our final point, the importation of clinical Freudianism to stem the flow of feminism. Girls in the 20s and 30s found themselves halfway in and halfway out of the traditional roles. Thus, they were neither insulated and protected from the larger world as before, nor were they equipped to deal with it. Both their personal and work lives suffered. Their frustration often took hysterical forms, complicated by the fact that they were despised the world over for even the little false liberation they had achieved. Mass confusion sent them in droves to the psychoanalysts. And where had all the psychoanalysts come from? By this time a war was going on in Europe, and much of the German and Austrian intelligentsia had settled here in search of a practice. It was ideal. A whole class of suffering people awaited them. And it was not just a few bored, rich women who were sucked into the new religion. For America was undergoing serious cramps from withholding a sexual revolution already well beyond the beginning stages. Everyone suffered, men as well as women. Books came out with such titles as How to Live with a Neurotic, because that oppressed class is right there in your kitchen, whining and complaining and nagging. Soon men, too, were turning up at the psychoanalysts. Well-educated, responsible citizens, not just psychos. And children. Whole new fields were opened to deal with the influx. Child psychology, clinical psychology, group therapy, marriage counseling services, any variation you can think of, name it, and there it was. And none of it was enough. The demand multiplied faster than new departments could be opened up in colleges. That these new departments were soon filled up with women is no wonder. Masses of searching women studied psychology with a passion in the hope of finding a solution to their quote-unquote hang-ups. But women who had grown interested in psychology because its raw material touched them where they lived soon were spouting jargon about marital adjustment and sex role responsibility. Psychology departments became halfway houses to send women scurrying back, quote-unquote, adjusted to their traditional roles as wives and mothers. Those women who persisted in demanding careers became, in their turn, instruments of the repressive educational system, their newfound psychological quote-unquote insight, that babble of child psych, social work 301, and L-Ed, serving to keep a fresh generation of women and children down. Psychology became reactionary to its core, its potential as a serious discipline undermined by its usefulness to those in power. And psychology was not the only new discipline to be corrupted. Education, social work, sociology, anthropology, all the related behavioral sciences, remained for years pseudosciences, overburdened with a double function, the indoctrination of women, as well as the study of quote-unquote human behavior. Reactionary schools of thought developed. Social science became quote-unquote functional, studying the operation of institutions only within the given value system, thus promoting acceptance of the status quo. It is not surprising that these remained quote-unquote women's fields. Men soon fled to exclusively male quote-unquote pure science. Women, still only semi-educated, awed with their new entrance into academia, were left to be snowed with the pseudoscientific bullshit. For, in addition to role indoctrination, the behavioral sciences served as a dike to keep the hordes of questing, quote-unquote, nouveau intellectuals from entering the quote-unquote real sciences. Physics, engineering, biochemistry, etc., sciences that in a technological society bore an increasingly direct relation to control of that society. As a result, even access to higher education, one of the few victories of the early women's rights movement, was subverted. More average women went to college than ever before, with less effect. Often the only difference between the modern college-educated housewife and her traditional prototype was the jargon she used in describing her marital hell. In short, Freudian theory, regroomed for its new function of quote-unquote social adjustment, was used to wipe up the feminist revolt. Patching up with band-aids the casualties of the aborted feminist revolution, it succeeded in quieting the immense social unrest and role confusion that followed in the wake of the first attack on the rigid patriarchal family. It is doubtful that the sexual revolution could have remained paralyzed at halfway point for half a century without its help, for the problems stirred up by the first wave of feminism are still not resolved today. D. H. Lawrence and Bernard Shaw are no less relevant than they were in their own time. Wilhelm Reich's The Sexual Revolution could have been written yesterday. Freudianism was the perfect foil for feminism because, though it struck the same nerve, it had a safety catch that feminism didn't. It never questioned the given reality. While both at their cores are explosive, Freudianism was gradually revised to suit the pragmatic needs of clinical therapy. It became an applied science complete with white-coated technicians, its contents subverted for a reactionary end, the socialization of men and women to an artificial sex role system. But there was just enough left of its original force to serve as a lure for those seeking their way out of oppression, causing Freudianism to go in the public mind from extreme suspicion and dislike to its current status. Psychoanalytic expertise is the final say in everything from marital breakups to criminal court judgments. Thus, Freudianism gained the ground that feminism lost. It flourished at the expense of feminism to the extent that it acted as a container of its shattering force. Only recently have we begun to feel the generations of drugging. Half a century later, women are waking up. There is a new emphasis on objective social conditions in psychology, as well as in the behavioral sciences. These disciplines, only now, decades after the damage has been done, are reacting to their long prostitution with demands for scientific verification, but an end to quote-unquote objectivity and a reintroduction of quote-unquote value judgments. The large numbers of women in these fields may soon start using this fact to their advantage, and a therapy that has proven worse than useless may eventually be replaced with the only thing that can do any good: political organization.